All right.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Miala Annual Conference. I'm your session moderator, Hui Hua Chua. So please keep your microphone on mute until you need to ask a question, and you can ask questions at any time by entering them into the chat panel, and I will then ask the questions for you at the end of the session. We'll keep all questions till the end of the presentation. After the session, please take a moment to provide feedback by filling out the session evaluation form in the conference portal. Okay, so to get started, today's presentation is Centering Student Voices to Create Effective eLearning, a User Experience Application, from Denise Layton and Naomi Binney from the University of Michigan.
All right, should we get started?
Take it away.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Naomi Binney. I'm the Digital Education Librarian at University of Michigan Library, and my colleague.
Hi, I'm Denise Layton. I'm the Strategic Projects Coordinator in Library Environments at the University of Michigan Library.
So we will look at our agenda for today. Please, Denise. Or am I missing it? We should be moving to the Padlet activity. No, it's not going. Sorry, everybody. We're working out our working from home. There we go. There's our agenda.
Thought I was screen sharing.
I believe you are screen sharing.
Let me just stop and try again. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to pick this one. Share. And present. Can you see my slides?
We're getting there.
No?
We're on loading. There we go. We're good. Thank you.
Oh.
Okay, so our agenda, there it is. Our agenda for today, we are first going to do a Padlet activity just to hear from all of you so we know, kind of what you're thinking, and we will bring that in throughout the whole presentation. We are going to talk about UX and usability testing, what it is, what it means to do this stuff, and then why is it relevant for e-learning. We will look at steps for applying usability testing and what it might look like for you if you want to try this. We'll do some case studies about what we've done, hopefully inform you so that you can create your own usability test and give you some resources. And then the plan is to leave time for questions. So we will do our best to do that. Next slide. Okay, so this is our Padlet activity. So that bit.ly link, I'm going to put it in the chat as well. If everyone can go there. There it is in the chat. So if you want to type that in yourself or copy and paste it. So what we're looking for is wondering, when you are creating an e-learning object, what feedback are you looking for your asynchronous online learning object? So what do you want to know? Do you want to make sure it's the right length, make sure buttons work? So if you want to take a couple minutes, we'd love to hear what you're thinking about that stuff.
All right, seeing a lot of things coming in here.
We'll give a couple more minutes, or at least another minute, to let people kind of type in things that they're thinking. But this is going to help inform us towards the end of our presentation. We are going to go back to these and kind of address all of these interests and questions and think about, let's say, if you wanted to make sure that it's engaging, how do we measure that? How do we do usability testing to find out if it's engaging? So we will get back to that towards the end.
All right, so as we are setting the stage for our presentation today, we wanted to just go over a couple of definitions. So UX, what is it? UX is, or user experience, is a field of practice that attempts to make things more useful, usable, and desirable through research and design. And its origins are within the tech industry. And it's been around for a long time, but has had like a big resurgence or increase in visibility in the past probably 20 some years. It applies concepts from many different fields, including product development, anthropology, and design, and others. It's really a very large, encompassing field, but it focuses in on a thing that you're trying to design, understanding who's trying to use it, and trying to make the thing as useful to the person trying to use it as possible. So that gets into usability. So usability is a core tenet of UX. It can be broken apart into a few different areas here that I thought I'd cover. So learnability, how easy is it for users to accomplish basic tasks first time they encounter the design? Efficiency, once users have learned the design, how quickly can they perform tasks? Memorability, when users return to the design after a period of not using it, how easily can they reestablish proficiency? Errors, how many errors do users make? How severe are these errors? And how easily can they recover from the errors? And finally, satisfaction, how pleasant is it to use the design? So that's from the Nielsen-Norman Group, which is kind of a big player in the UX usability world. They provide a lot of resources, articles about UX. So that leads us to usability testing. So usability testing is one method within the UX field, basically where you're trying to evaluate the user experience of something and really trying to dig deep into those different parts of usability by having somebody try out whatever it is you're designing.
So next up, how do we apply all of that to e-learning? So one thing to keep in mind, for me personally, sometimes I felt a little overwhelmed by the idea of doing usability testing, even though it seemed straightforward, like you're just doing some testing and finding out what people think. I always felt a little intimidated by it, and it was actually really helpful for me to attend some Mayala sessions, one of which Denise led, and I have talked to Denise a lot to really figure out how to do this stuff and learn about it. And something that is really helpful for me to keep in mind is that I'm probably already doing informal usability studies. So when we're asking colleagues and students for feedback on lesson plans or digital learning objects, it's really an informal method of user experience, right? So that's something to keep in mind that's been helpful for me. And then, so what we want to ask, right, is like, how do we even know if our e-learning design is working? It's like a big question in asynchronous teaching design. Is it even effective? Sometimes we just kind of throw them out into the world and we're like, well, I hope this is doing what it needs to be done in library e-learning, with modules. Sometimes it just depends. Do you know how much your students are actually going to be giving you feedback, or is it just kind of going out into the world, into a class, and do you ever get to hear back about, if the modules are being used and if they're working? So it's always a little bit of a challenge when it comes to e-learning inside libraries. So it's really helpful to do this usability testing beforehand, before it goes live, to sort of get that information and find out if things are actually working the way you want them to. So ultimately, it's about getting to know our users and their needs, right? And really trying to identify what those needs are and then creating a better design for those needs. Next slide, please. Oh, you got it. Other ways to assess e-learning. So keeping that in mind, what are the ways that a lot of us are already doing e-learning assessment? So often we're kind of creating our own evaluations. So at least within my department, I'm one of the e-learning librarians, and I will often ask other librarians to review my course or review modules, time themselves and see how long it takes, and get feedback, right? But that's a demographic of people that are really more like myself, that have been working in libraries a long time and have master's degrees, and it's a different kind of group than what we're really going for. So it's helpful, but it's not quite the same. And then of course quizzes, those are our usual assessments for evaluating student feedback or student responses, looking at their scores, maybe looking at how well students are doing on certain questions, and say, like, okay, is this too easy, too complicated, right? Is the course fulfilling those learning objectives? And then we also have the option of post-course surveys, right? So we can ask students, did you find it helpful? Did this work? And the problem with this, right, is like sometimes it's just subjective and it's not always possible to even get students to do post-course surveys, because we don't always have the luxury of accessing the students afterwards. So there are ways to do e-learning assessment and ways to assess it, but it really helps to have that usability beforehand. So next slide. So we really wanted to put some focus on the idea of centering student voices. So thinking about this activity of doing usability is really like empowering student voices and making sure that we center their perspective. So a lot of times we are assessing e-learning through those quizzes and those surveys, colleague reviews, but doing it this way allows us to really center that student perspective. In our case at U of M, we use Canvas, and so we know that students are regularly using Canvas. They're very comfortable with it, and a lot of our e-learning modules end up on Canvas. So they already know the tool. So we're not necessarily assessing whether or not Canvas works, but we are assessing how well our learning objectives are working or carrying through within the modules. And because they're already comfortable using those tools, at this point, we're really just saying, hey, but did you learn the thing that we wanted you to learn, right? And so we're really trying to center their perspective. They're the ones that we really are trying to serve ultimately with our design. And so doing it this way is really helpful for making sure that we're hearing from the actual user. Next slide.
Yes. So now that we've kind of covered the why of why we think usability testing is a compelling method for e-learning objects, now we're going to go a little bit through the steps of how. So for this, I kind of want to just start at the beginning. So with this, you're going to think about what you're trying to evaluate and what are the goals for your course. So that's your learning objectives, of course, which you're always starting with something that you're making, but it's also how you want to deliver it, or the audience for the course and the design. So, is this going to be something that's asynchronous? Is this something, a one-shot kind of class? Do you want students to be like, do you want students to be able, kind of like the voice of it, like, how do you want it to sound? How long do you want it to take? So some of those learning objective goals, but also some of your course design goals as well. So from there, develop a protocol that directs students on how you want them to interact with your course. What do you want them to do on their own? What do you want to observe? What follow-up questions might you have? So this is basically taking your goals for your course and thinking about, how can I get students to interact with the course in a way that would help me observe how they interact with it, or answer questions that I might have about it. So this could come in a variety of different ways. You could write a script where you're sort of sending the course out to somebody to try it out. You ask them to take a course and then answer a series of questions about it afterwards. Or you could add on to that by asking a student to come in for, say, an interview, where you might be giving them a task or a scenario and saying, find this part of the course and then kind of give me a summary of the information about it. And in that case, you would be able to hear what they say about the course, but you would also be able to observe what they're doing as they click through the buttons, as they kind of navigate, as they read the content that you're developing. So then within that protocol, you're going to want to define what success is in the interaction. So this helps you then later be able to analyze your results and kind of see what you've learned. So if I consider success in the course being able to know where it starts and navigate the buttons all the way to the end, then that would be like 100% success. And so if somebody has trouble along the way, you would be able to mark that and think about what kind of solutions might you put into place. Or maybe you just want general information. You might not want to go full in on testing. And I think what we're trying to emphasize today is that you can find the right fit for you. You don't have to feel pressured to do a correct usability test. It's just a kind of method that you could apply to really add on to your course design. So then your next part would be recruiting participants. Ideally, this would be people who would actually be taking your course. So like Naomi was saying, it's helpful to get perspectives from your colleagues, but they're not really the users of this course. They're, familiar with a different vocabulary or have taken many, design courses themselves. So they might have some blind spots to what students are really looking for. So continuing on with these steps. So next you're going to want to set up your technology. So in the past, I've done these in person where I'm having like a small focus group with a few different participants. But in our virtual world, usability testing actually works really well in a virtual world, just simply with a Zoom or any kind of video conferencing where you can share a screen, because the participant can just share their screen and then you can see them interact as they kind of talk through what they're doing. And you can also record it so that it can be as simple as that. Then you'll want to run your test. So I said, remember a consent form. You know, this is a study that somebody's participating in. And it's also helpful to have a facilitator as well as a note taker if you're kind of going for that full test version, or going through some kind of format where you're actually interacting and having a conversation with the user about the thing you're designing your course. Next, you're going to analyze your results. And so, like I said, depending on the type of results you're looking for, this will affect your analysis. So what stood out that you could change? Where were participants struggling? And I just wanted to note that the point to me of usability testing is that this is guidance, not conclusions. This isn't the kind of research where you're making generalizations about a population. You're really just looking for a direction to help amplify the design of your course. So it's not going to be perfect. And even, you know, if you did this with many users, there would probably still be something else you might be able to find. But that's why often in usability testing, we talk about doing this with around 5 users can actually give you a little bit of insight into what more general people might be looking for. 5 people for user group. So after you've made the changes based on that analysis, you might want to test again. But you know, it's kind of a process to do all these other steps. And so you might just feel ready. Now I'm going to launch my course. I have, you know, instead of sort of just pushing it out there without really knowing how people are going to respond, I've internalized some feedback, made some adjustments, and now I'm going to push my course out. All right, so now we wanted to talk about a couple of examples where we actually did this. I am not a learning and teaching person. I am not an instructor, but I do a lot of, so what I do is focus on the in-person user experience and how to improve that. But within that, I often am helping out with various trainings. So a couple of years ago, a group of colleagues and we were making a training module within Canvas. And so that was our learning management system at U of M again. So I had never used Canvas before. And so I really was kind of like learning Canvas while also trying to design like a nice training course. And so we put together this training module that was meant for our staff as well as our students. And as we assessed, you know, what do we want to get feedback on? What are the goals for this course? We wanted to know about the organization and clarity of content, use of media and quizzes, and the overall impression of the course. And so we set up 2 mechanisms to collect that feedback. We asked some of our full-time staff colleagues who this training was for to take the course, and as they went through, they used the discussion board function within the course to answer specific questions about each part of the course. So that really helped us evaluate in one way. And then we also had students, our student staff, take this as well. And they, we asked them to review the course in advance. And we did some follow-up interviews with them. And within that, we prompted them to click around the course. So this was kind of multi-part, different ways of evaluating the course. And so I wanted to share our example script with you, because again, we really kind of want to demystify this and say, you know, I went through what 10 steps, but just really to say that these can be simple questions, a lot of like what's coming up in the Padlet. So this is our actual training protocol that we used. And so I had that note taker and a facilitator. And in a small group session, we, you know, introduced ourselves. We did some get to know you questions. And then we got into the interview where we really just started broad overall impression of the course, and talked about level of difficulty, how easy, difficult did you find it to use the training materials? Please give specific examples when possible. So then in that way, when they were giving specific examples, we asked them to navigate to the part of the course they might remember, in which case we could observe them interacting with the course. And we kind of just went on from there. Did information flow smoothly from one topic to the next? Put a different order of presentation, make material easier to understand. So as you can see, these questions are going to give back opinions. They're not necessarily exactly what the person did, but with the already going through the course content and then answering the questions, they can be really insightful. So I'll continue on here. So as a result of this, we made some changes to the course. We adjusted the voice of the content to be more conversational. We added more quizzes that were shorter and intermixed, as well as added feedback when a person chose the wrong answer to emphasize the quiz's role as a teaching tool rather than being punitive. We ensured that visuals which reference content were on the same page as that content. We changed the order and labeling of certain content, and we integrated additional Canvas functionality as well. All right.
All right, so now we'll jump into my case study. Also, I apologize, I've been getting that internet is unstable, which I have not gotten all day. I've been on Zoom plenty of times today, so I apologize if suddenly I'm coming in and out. So the second case study we're sharing is from my project with my colleague Jesus Espinosa here at the UM Library. We are working on a module about evaluating sources specifically for undergraduate students, but typically this would be used by first-year students, maybe second-year students, typically in writing classes. And so this is a Canvas module that is usually integrated into other instructors' courses on Canvas. So same as Denise, we were looking for feedback, and I talked to Denise a number of times before I actually went ahead and did this, just to make sure I was like doing it right. But as you've seen from what she's explained, is like, for one thing, you just kind of got to do it, right? That's what I learned, is just do it, ask questions. This is not something that you're turning in for a grade. There isn't like maybe a perfect way to do it. So basically, we're looking for the same feedback, the organization and clarity of the content. Are we using media and quizzes well? And then what is the overall impression of the course? So we actually did want to also ask students. Students were our main goal, but staff and librarians we also included in feedback, just to get a sense of what our colleagues thought, and because all of our colleagues have so much experience teaching, and we just want to make sure we're hearing from them as well. So we have PIC students, and the PIC students at U of M, it's a PIC, it's peer information counselors. They're from various backgrounds, they're at different points in their academic careers. They do have a are pretty comfortable with using the library. So they're not the perfect demographic because they're not necessarily completely new, but they are students and they're still closer to that new student experience than we are. So we actually used Google Docs as well. I did not link it here, but we did a separate Google Doc for PIC student feedback and for staff and librarians. And what we did was we basically went line by line, each page in Canvas, and shared the title, and then asked students to give us their reflections or their feedback on each page. And if there was nothing, they said nothing. But it was actually pretty helpful. So if you want to go to the next slide for me, I'll show you the comments, some of the comments we got. So this is again from PIC students. Someone explained from the beginning there didn't seem to be a clear definition of evaluating sources, and they asked that we maybe get a little more deep into what that means to even evaluate sources. So there's sometimes when you're a teaching librarian, sometimes you forget that you're using terms like let's evaluate sources and let's use databases, and we still have to define our terms because not every student just comes into college knowing what those things mean. There were broken links that they caught for us. We fixed that. One interesting comment was that we had used Wikipedia to define a concept. We were talking about MSG and the sort of like bias against MSG and how that is an uninformed bias, and that science shows that MSG does not actually damage your health in any real way. But we used Wikipedia to define MSG, and then the student said, sometimes we're told not to use Wikipedia, right? So like, can you explain why we would use this? So we clarified and said, like, you can use Wikipedia for maybe understanding concepts or defining things for yourself, but you're not going to use that ultimately as one of your sources, right? Another student mentioned that it would be helpful to include screenshots of a certain thing we were talking about, and that students often skip these things. So having that image will help them process it and actually pay attention. So that was some really helpful feedback. And this is my first time of probably really clearly getting student feedback on a module, and I found it to be immensely helpful. And they found things and had comments that I was not hearing from other librarians or staff, and it was really, really incredible. Next slide. So some of the changes that we made to the course after hearing from students. So we clarified concepts. We added that language around using Wikipedia. We fixed broken links. We added screenshots and images. We had some text-heavy pages, and so we've heard different things from students over the years. Some students say, I'm more likely to read it when there's more text because it means it's important. And then other students will say, you know, I don't want to read something that's so text-heavy. So there's kind of a varieties of, you know, ways to approach that, but we decided to break it up. And also we noticed that Canvas had turned some of the fonts gray, so we turned them back to black just to make it easier. Next slide.
Okay. So overall, by doing this, Naomi and I have both really learned a lot. And as she was kind of saying, this was her first time doing this. And for me, this was my first time applying usability testing in this area. But I think both of us can really say that by observing a user interact with your content, it can really give insights and ideas about using online modules to accomplish learning objectives that are hard to get in other ways. And I think that, you know, Naomi, as a very experienced instructional designer who's designed a number of courses, and me as a more experienced UX person, I think this combination, it really makes a lot of sense in terms of how a course really is basically like an interface. And what you can control within that interface is the content and the organization of the content. And so this method just really applies really well. It also doesn't have to be complicated, kind of like what we said a few times. A simple Google Doc asking for feedback can make a huge difference for your course. And then you can expand it in other ways more if you'd like to have that in-person communication with someone. Also, this gives students a voice and agency over online modules, which is really empowering. You know, students, we have high expectations for what we want students to get out of these things. So it's really nice to have that exchange with students instead of kind of like pushing something one way out. This is one way to bring a little bit more feedback in, and not just within the context of the course, but before there's all the pressure put in place about really trying to learn from something, because, you know, often that course environment can be really stressful to people. So this is getting feedback about something outside of its context, but still useful to the context where it's going to be applied. And yeah, like we said, even a seasoned e-learning designer needs feedback and must be open to suggestions and edits. And then I also just wanted to add on a few points here about how usability testing is not like a silver bullet. There is bias and power within this feedback mechanism, just like there is in any other kind of assessment mechanism we might use. So even through observation, it's important to recognize that you're not seeing an unbiased interaction. So like I was saying, you know, this is a scenario that you've set up, and you are kind of in control of this, and you're seeing interactions, but you're not ever going to be able to kind of like record somebody just using the course by themselves. And even if you did, they would know they're being recorded, and so they might kind of act in a different way. So different testing styles might bring different results, but overall, again, this is about guidance and direction and trying to make your course more usable. Also, there's power dynamics within courses or any kind of feedback mechanism, especially, you know, you as a moderator, this is a student, you're a library employee. So as you're asking for feedback, are they really going to kind of tell it to you straight, or is there going to be some kind of filter within that? There's just a power structure that you can kind of manage through different ways, building rapport within your conversation, you know, starting with some of those opening questions and trying to relate to each other as humans before you get into the feedback. But ultimately that power doesn't go away. So it's important to recognize within any assessment mechanism you're doing. Also, the person doing the testing, and you're right, okay, so you're the person doing the testing and then they're being tested. You know, it's a big thing to say in user experience as well as usability testing, like we're not testing you, we're testing the system. But as somebody who's said that many, many times to different people, people still express feelings of like, oh, I'm a failure, I'm so stupid for not getting this. And so that's a big part of asking somebody to kind of be vulnerable and show you how they would use something. Is if they perceive that they've made a mistake, it can really impact the way that they're thinking about it. So it's just important to recognize that. And also, as in every interaction, we bring our identities and experiences to the table. And so I, as a white cis woman, bring that to the table. And whenever I'm interacting with somebody else, they're bringing their identities to the table, and there's power dynamic within that. So it's just important to recognize. All right, so with that, we're going to get into creating your own test and our question and answer time. Sorry, I was looking at the time there. So we have a number of resources here to help you create your own test. But we're also just going to look back at the Padlet now and try to kind of answer some of the questions that you've posed that you have for your own learning objects. So I'm going to pull out to the Padlet. Can you still see my screen, Naomi?
Yes.
Looking good? All right, so looking through here, our question again was, what feedback do you want about your asynchronous online learning objects? What do you want to know? So one that stands out to me first is it effective, which is one of the questions we kind of started with. Does it order concepts in a way that builds on students' understanding? So I think that one way you might go around organizing a protocol there would be to have somebody take the course and like pause at each area where you're building a concept and see if it's building over time, right? So that's kind of like a typical quiz that you could do, but you could have it be more written out, and then you could do that follow-up interview where you could talk about the flow of between the concepts. Does it feel like they're building on each other, or do they feel really separate? How can I better connect these concepts together? Is there an example that could kind of carry through the course the full way? So what stands out to you, Naomi?
All right, let's see. I think the one just below it, at least on my screen, is it engaging for students, or is the amount of information overwhelming? And I also struggle with that one because I'm a talker, and which also translates sometimes to I'm a writer. So I will put a lot of information because I want to make sure that the students are getting everything they could possibly need so they don't feel confused. But then, right, does it become overwhelming? I'm curious, Denise, if you have a sort of feeling about how you would tackle that or how you would measure that.
Yeah, I think in terms of tackling it, I would think about first maybe trying to apply some design guidelines for web content in general, right? Like trying to use bulleted list, thinking about the order of the content. But I think in some ways you could almost do something where you could do like an A/B test. We didn't get into this, but you could write one version and then write another, have the person even live in the room maybe be reading through it on their own, give them ample time, 10 full minutes to read a page or something so it doesn't feel pressurized or like a test. And then you could have the person compare, or you could do it twice. You could give the course to one sort of set course to one set of students and then another to another. Or really just maybe try having people read through it and then ask them to summarize what it was. And I think that, you know, they'll try to do that, but they'll also, if you just ask, like, was this overwhelming? They might just say yes, or like ask a less biased question and say, what was your impression of reading through this? How was it for you? So those are some ideas. And yeah, as you can see, like it's a little bit messy. It's not perfect, but it's a way to, again, get that engagement from students. Let's see. Well, we have until, oh yes, we're at our Q&A time. So let's welcome a few more questions into the chat. And then Naomi and I can kind of also just keep talking through a few more things that are here in the Padlet.
Yeah, if you all want to go ahead and start entering questions and any kind of Q&A questions you might have in the chat. I did want to note that something I see in the Padlet is, does it meet the requirements of students with special needs? And to my mind, I immediately think about, you know, is there someone you can talk to who's an accessibility specialist? Or if you don't have one, maybe there's a way that you can do some accessibility testing. And I'm assuming, Denise, that there's some usability testing you can do on your own to test that.
Test out. Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Sorry, there was a question that said, does it meet the requirements of students with special needs?
Yeah, so I think that gets me thinking about accessibility and different kinds of web accessibility standards. And I think that this is a push and pull, especially for learning management systems or other systems that you can't control, which is that there's often functionality within the system that is more or less accessible for people using different online web tools or using the word is slipping my mind, I'm sorry, but who are accessing the web in different ways, maybe with a screen reader or other tools that help amplify their experience. So that is one part, but I think that, again, it comes down to kind of your content and organization. How are you ordering it? How are you integrating images and then describing the images, making sure that everyone has comparable experiences there. Also, thinking about, there are certain functionalities in your system that are going to be less accessible. So like tables, a variety of different things within Canvas that different quiz options that aren't translatable to a screen reader. So I kind of think a little bit more about that on the kind of web standard accessibility side. And you can, if you can try to find somebody who uses a screen reader or other tools that help them access the web, that can really help you see how your course is being used. But you can also kind of try it out yourself in that way and learn about the design standards for accessibility.
Awesome. So we have some questions in the chat. So the first question was, do you tap into your student workers as UX testers at all? So actually, so yes, so the PIC students are student workers. And Denise, I think some of the students you used were also student workers, right?
Yes, but in that case, the training was for student workers, so it was particularly applicable. But it was really useful in that we kind of negotiated with their supervisors that instead of having to pay an incentive, they just got a paid hour for participating in this. I think they actually maybe got paid 2 hours to participate in it.
Yeah, that's an important note that I actually meant to share in the presentation. But so it's important to me that these students are getting paid for it. So we're not asking students to just do like free labor of some kind. And the next question actually kind of leads into this. So Gabby asks, basically, how do librarians setting up a user test solicit volunteers who are newer or wouldn't actually be attracted to this kind of thing? Do you think this is important? Because yeah, so the PIC students, right, were a little more experienced, but we have a variety of ways that you can incentivize. So sometimes that might mean gift cards or whatever little gifts you can offer, depending on if you have a budget or not. Denise, do you want to talk about the focus group that you all have?
Yeah, so the focus group for the, I'm always like reading the next question and then you're throwing it back to me. The focus group that you tested our course?
So I'm referring to, there's a focus group. I think that there's a focus group of students that are interested, and they can sign up to get emails for user testing, right,
Yeah.
at the library.
So for at our library, we have set up over the years an email list where people can sign up to say they're interested in participating in a paid study. And then we've built it up quite a bit over the years, you know, going to tabling, or if we run a survey, we ask people if they would like to take other surveys in different ways. So we've built that list up over time, and then we can also often find participants in that way.
So there's another question. How does one find best practices for asynchronous teaching? One expert instructor told me that the instructor should not talk for more than 10 minutes, then break it up with a video or a short discussion or hands-on activity. What do you think? So we can have a whole other presentation about, you know, best practices for asynchronous learning. It's tough. You know, it depends a lot on a lot of varieties of things. So what the content is, what kind of classes we're talking about. Some students, some kinds of asynchronous learning will work great for them, and others it's not going to work. So I think the pandemic is an odd time because normally students who maybe choose asynchronous learning on purpose because they have lives where they need that flexibility and they learn well that way, oftentimes those students choose to do online classes. And this past year, there was no choice, right? Everyone was just forced into asynchronous learning. So it's kind of difficult. It's not always best for every student. There's really lots of varieties. Um, oh, yes, but I would suggest there are lots of different places that you can look for resources around that. I did a whole master's in instructional technology. I still have so many things to learn. So, you know, there's a lot out there, but I think some ways to start is if you look up ADDIE, I'll put it in the chat, ADDIE. That's a sort of framework for building online learning design. There's research that shows all kinds of varieties of things that, you know, videos should be short, there should be lots of chunking so that students can have breaks. But, you know, I've done some research myself with a colleague, and it depends a lot of times on the student, and sometimes longer pages of information work really well for some people and others don't. So, you know, not a great answer, but there's a lot of different ways to approach it. And I think just kind of starting some research and looking around and figuring out what's out there. But there's other conferences that really tackle online learning too that are really helpful.